Hello, my name is Tayo Afawape, and I am the Director of Administration and Compliance with the Community Development Administration. I am also here with Justin Jackson, who is the Executive Director, Stephanie Christian, who is a Program Manager, and Trey McCarter, who is our Environmental Reviewer. Thank you for joining today's session called Organizational Requirements. This training is one of several trainings that will occur this week, as highlighted on our schedule. To recap, yesterday consisted of an overview of the non-housing RFP and an introduction to eGrants, which is our online grant management system where applicants submit and track their proposals. As promised yesterday, the RFP is now live on eGrants, and a PDF version of the RFP is accessible on our website. The website link should be in the chat box with further instructions on how to obtain important information. Today, we will cover organizational requirements, which will cover programmatic aspects of CDBG funding, while tomorrow we will cover financial aspects in the CDBG financial management training at 1 p.m. Also starting at 1 p.m., but on Thursday, we will discuss eligibility requirements to determine if proposed projects are eligible under this RFP and conclude with our best practices workshop, which will discuss best practices to utilize when completing the RFP. Let's begin the CDBG Organizational Requirements Workshop. There are three goals of this workshop: to review requirements necessary to operate a CDBG-funded program, to determine if your organization meets general requirements to apply for and be awarded CDBG funding, and to provide an overview of programmatic requirements. Financial requirements will be discussed in our financial management capacity building workshop. We will first cover general requirements regarding nonprofits demonstrating sufficient infrastructure to undertake the proposed CDBG activity. Secondly, we will cover registrations and clearances as it relates to agencies acquiring an EIN number, enrolling into the federal government SAM.gov system to obtain a UEI number, documenting no hiring of unauthorized aliens by using Verify, and obtaining CBI clearance by having an active business license or exemption and being current on taxes. Thirdly, we will review the required coverage and limits of various types of insurances and bonding. Fourthly, we will review key policies and procedures, notably conflict of interest as it relates to persons working under the CDBG activity, non-discrimination and grievance policies for clients participating in the CDBG activity, and affirmative action plans that ensure equal employment opportunities. Lastly, we will review non-housing construction requirements for agencies applying for public improvement or facility activities. Site control, project schedule, construction budget, site photos, and an agency construction resume must be included in the application. Design documents and environmental assessments are optional, but will be required if the agency is CDBG funded. All CDBG funded agencies must adhere to CDA procurement requirements for micro purchases that exceed $10,000 per vendor. This is an increase from the previous $2,000 threshold. This presentation, however, will focus on CDA procurement requirements as it relates to soliciting a contractor or general contractor. With construction projects, adherence to other city and federal regulations such as MBE, WBE, Davis-Bacon, and Section 3 may also be required. Applicants must be either an intergovernmental entity or nonprofit agencies or organizations to apply for this non-housing RFP. Applicants can also include independent public agencies such as urban renewal agencies or housing authorities. If you are a developer or a general contractor seeking CDA funding for housing construction, please do not apply for funding under this RFP. Instead, please go to CDA's website to determine when the next Notice of Funding Availability, or NOFA, is active. Applicants under this non-housing RFP must apply for funding via eGrants, an electronic grant application management system that is web-based. For those unfamiliar with eGrants, there is an eGrants tutorial that can be accessed on the CDA website. When applying for funding, the first 3 items you must upload are a certificate of good standing. A certificate of good standing documents that an agency is legally registered in Missouri and abides by state requirements. It can be acquired from the Missouri Secretary of State website, which is www.sos.mo.gov. The certificate must be issued and state sealed on or after July 1st of 2022. You must also upload your 501c3 determination letter. This letter documents that an agency is a nonprofit entity exempt from federal income taxes. You must also upload your IRS 990. This document is the nonprofit's financial statements made available to the public. CDA needs either the most current IRS 990 or proof of an approved extension. If you're awarded CDBG funds, you will need to provide additional documents prior to entering a contract with CDA. You will need a state tax exempt letter. This letter documents that an agency is a nonprofit exempt from sales tax. Secondly, you will need a state sealed certificate of incorporation along with a copy of the articles of incorporation. These documents establish that the entity exists under state law. Thirdly, you will need a copy of your board of directors bylaws. Bylaws are typically created at the inception of an entity and are amended as needed. They lay out how an organization will perform essential functions, such as how to run meetings and how to select, appoint, and remove board members. Fourthly, you will need a completed board member list with your current board of directors job titles and other information. This form will be provided by CDA for agencies to complete prior to entering into a contract. Organizations, including their bylaws, board members, staff, and/or potential partners, must demonstrate capacity to undertake the proposed activities. When applying for funding, you must provide resumes and job descriptions for staff involved in the administration, operation, and/or management of the proposed program. Resumes and job descriptions help raters of your proposal gauge the staff's level of experience in managing the proposed activity. You must also provide an organizational chart. An organizational chart is one way to demonstrate sufficient segregation of duties. If you have all programmatic staff and no one is responsible for handling the books, for example, the organization does not have sufficient organizational capacity. If you have not been previously funded by CDA, you will also need a letter of recommendation from a previous funder. CDA needs assurance that the agency has historically demonstrated being good stewards of different types of funds, especially with funds that are compliance heavy. Please note that aldermatic support letters do not meet this requirement. Applicants must certify that no conflict of interest will arise through the use of federal funds. This topic will be discussed more in depth later on. Furthermore, funds may not be used to support inherently religious activities. However, the following conditions apply. An organization may still engage in religious activities as long as they are voluntary and separate from the CDBG-funded activity. CDBG funds may not be used to support worship or religious instruction. A faith-based organization cannot be discriminated against or given preferential treatment on the basis of religion when applying for CDBG-funded services. Also, funds may not be used to support political or lobbying activities, such as get out the vote campaigns or canvassing for political candidates. Please pay attention to what you name your project and how you describe your service area to avoid any political connotations. For example, do not reference wards or alderpersons in your proposal. Instead, avoid political language by referencing service areas by neighborhood, census tracts, and/or zip codes. Next, I will cover registrations and clearances. All organizations must register with the IRS to obtain an employer identification number, or EIN, which is also known as a federal tax ID or a federal ID number. Tax-exempt organizations must be formed legally before applying for an EIN. Registration is free and online as indicated on the slide. If you need additional information about the IRS, go to www.irs.gov. As of April 4th of 2022, the Unique Entity Identifier, or UEI number, has replaced the DUNS number. Obtaining a UEI number is free and is required for all applicants under this RFP. The UEI number is generated in the System for Award Management known as SAM.gov, which is also the name of the website. In order to receive federal funding, businesses must have an active registration under SAM.gov, meaning that they cannot be debarred or working with the federal government, nor have any active exclusions, including delinquent federal taxes. Anticipate delays in obtaining a UEI number or updating your status on SAM.gov. Therefore, CDA strongly recommends that you start registration or renewals early. If funded, you will be required to comply with the statute section 285.500 RSMO and provide proof of E-Verify registration. The purpose of E-Verify is to demonstrate that the agency has not and will not knowingly hire an unauthorized alien for contracted services funded by the federal government. For more information about E-Verify, go to www.e-verify.gov. The City of St. Louis has a Central Business Index, or CBI, containing business tax and license records. For anyone to receive federal funding, the city requires that these records are current and show no sign of delinquency. This is called having or passing CBI clearance. Passing CBI clearance requires applicants to have a current business license or be deemed exempt. Nonprofits are typically exempt. However, do not presume that you are. Contact the license collector at 314-622-4528 to verify your exemption status. If you are deemed exempt, then you must be issued an exemption letter from the license collector. Applicants, furthermore, cannot have any delinquent federal, state, or local taxes. To obtain your tax status, contact the Collector of Revenue at 314-622-4111. If funded, CDA will require insurance and bonding coverage for the term of the contract to protect from loss due to theft, fraud, and/or undue physical damage related to the CDBG program. Note that the insurance and bonding limits are subject to change. If they do change, you will be notified prior to being under contract with CDA. These next two slides detail what the coverage and limits have been historically for insurance and bonding. CDA requires proof of three types of insurances: general liability, vehicle liability, and workers' comp. CDA needs proof of general liability insurance with a single incidence limit of at least $1 million per occurrence. CDA will also need proof of vehicle liability insurance for the minimum amount of $500,000 combined single limit per occurrence for bodily injury and property damage. Your agency still needs this coverage even if it does not own vehicles, because this coverage also includes employees who may drive their vehicles while conducting the CDBG-funded activity. The last type of insurance coverage is a workers' compensation policy as required under state statute. Generally, employers have to carry workers' comp, but there are exceptions. For more information about workers' comp to determine if your agency needs to obtain it, go to the Missouri Department of Insurance. The website is on the slide. The declaration page must list the City of St. Louis in care of CDA as an additional insured to the address of 1520 Market Street, Suite 2000, St. Louis, Missouri 63103. Please do not use the City Hall's address. You will need commercial blanket bond, also known as honesty bonding or crime coverage, for a minimum coverage of $25,000 per occurrence, covering all persons employed and or authorized to perform any function related to the CDBG program. Persons covered include the executive director, board members with signing authority, financial officers and staff, and CDBG staff. Next, I will cover required policies and procedures. Written policies and procedures are essential to the effective operations of any organization. There are guidelines to decision-making and allow for transparency. Prior to entering into a contract with CDA, agencies must provide a copy of their current personnel policies and procedures that define the treatment, rights, obligations, and relations of people within the organization. You shouldn't have policies and procedures that only address personnel issues. You should also have them to address how you will administer the CDBG-funded program. The CDBG program must meet our expectations as well as your organization's. For example, having an intake procedure to verify eligibility and gather client demographics provides uniformity and consistency in administering the program. Verifying eligibility in a consistent manner and having written procedures to track data and outcomes helps organizations submit accurate programmatic reporting to us on a monthly basis. Another example of having policies meeting everyone's expectations is in your file retention policy. CDA and HUD requires that all files related to the contract must be kept for no less than 3 years from the date of final payment under the contract. Your file retention policy should not be less stringent than this requirement. Policies and procedures should be written down not only for our sake, but for yours, especially if you have new staffing or are creating a new program. Written policies and procedures is one easy way to introduce the program to new members of your team and implement consistency in the administration of the activity. Other policies and procedures required by HUD and CDA include grievance, conflict of interest, and non-discrimination policies, and an affirmative action plan. These policies must be approved prior to entering into a contract with CDA should you receive funding. The next slides will cover these policies more in depth. Organizations must have 2 types of grievance policies. One pertains to employee grievances. Usually organizations already have this type of grievance policy in their personnel schedule. The second type, which sometimes organizations overlook, is a written policy for client complaints related to the CDBG program. Grievance policies for CDBG clients should include, but is not limited to, specifying the grievance specifying the response procedures, timeframe, and staff responsible for handling grievances, and addressing discrimination and complaints when clients feel deprived of benefits under the CDBG program. Depending upon the type of grievance filed, there are specific items and deadlines that must be adhered to. In particular, all discrimination complaints must be forwarded to the CDA Executive Director within 2 working days of the initial complaint. Discrimination complaints occur when applicants, participants, or registrants believe that they or any specific class of individuals has been or is being subject to discrimination. There are federally protected classes as well as city protected classes under city ordinances. For more information about city protected classes, please go to the website on the slide. Program complaints occur from feelings of being deprived from benefits that are offered under the CDBG program. Agencies should make reasonable efforts to resolve legitimately claimed deficiencies within 15 working days of the initial complaint. If the agency cannot do so, then the complaint must be forwarded to the CDA Executive Director within 2 working days of the exhaustion of remedies available to the agency under its grievance policy. As such, agencies can and probably should have more robust grievance procedures than the minimum requirements of CDA. There are many ways to create a grievance policy for program participants. For example, I've seen some where agencies create separate grievance policies for different programs, including CDBG-funded programs. I've seen other grievance policies where the agency already had a broad grievance policy for its clients, then added additional requirements should the grievance be related to a CDBG-funded program. Conflict of interest, whether they are real or apparent, are prohibited. They can potentially apply to any of the following persons employed or about to be employed by the agency: elected or appointed officials, staff and board members administering or involved in the decision-making of the CDBG program, and their immediate family and business partners. If any of these persons stand to obtain a financial interest or benefit from the awarding or contracting of a CDBG-funded project, then a conflict of interest has occurred. Conflict of interest regulations apply during the tenure of the person in question and for 1 year thereafter. HUD, however, may grant an exception, but before making their final determination, they would need the following documentation: the agency's request for an exception in writing to CDA before the conflict of interest occurs, the opinion of CDA's attorney that the exception does not violate state or local law, and the ad publishing the conflict of interest in a newspaper of general circulation paid for by the person with the conflict. HUD will then consider an extensive list of factors and make their determination on a case-by-case basis. Here are some examples of conflict of interest occurring within an organization. The son of a board member was hired as the program coordinator of a CDBG-funded after-school program. In this situation, the hire is related to a board member who has decision-making authority, causing the hire to have a conflict of interest. A senior center has a board member who participates in CDBG-funded exercise programs at the center. In this situation, a person with decision-making authority is also recipient of the CDBG-funded services, causing a conflict of interest. The executive director of a CDBG-funded food pantry also owns an accounting company which has been awarded a contract to provide accounting services. In this situation, the executive director, having decision-making and insider knowledge about the CDBG-funded activity, is financially benefiting from the CDBG funding, which is causing a conflict of interest. Catching potential conflict of interest as early as possible is critical because should they happen, they can result in the repayment of funds. For this very reason, prior to entering a contract with CDA, we look to see if the agency's personnel manual contains a section covering conflict of interest that is not contrary to HUD and CDA regulations. In addition, also before entering into a contract, CDA requires that board members, executive director, staff paid with CDBG funds, and staff involved with the management, administration, and procurement sign a conflict of interest form. CDBG-funded staff will also be required to sign a questionnaire regarding secondary employment. Agencies usually already have a non-discrimination policy in their personnel manual. If funded, CDA requires agencies to incorporate CDA's non-discrimination policy into their own non-discrimination policy. Furthermore, you must comply with all equal opportunity law and/or regulations contained in your contract with CDA. Also in your personnel manual, ensure that you have an affirmative action plan guided by the President's Executive Order 11246 as amended. This plan shall include, but not be limited to, a statement of policy concerning employment, promotion, demotion, transfer, recruitment, and recruitment advertising, layoffs, and selection for training. I would recommend starring these last 3 slides because they summarize what items applicants and awardees will need. Your application will require the following items: your IRS 501c3 determination number, which would include the federal tax ID number, your UEI number received from SAM.gov, certificate of good standing from the Missouri Secretary of State website, your current IRS 990 or PEAD extension, resumes and job descriptions of staff involved in the program. This includes staff whose salaries are not being funded with CDBG, as well as persons who have fiscal and procurement responsibilities. Attach your your organizational chart and a letter of recommendation from a previous funder, if not previously funded by CDA. Here's a list of items needed prior to entering into a contract with CDA. We call these items contract attachments. Your state tax exempt letter, state sealed certificate of incorporation, along with a copy of your articles of incorporation, your agency's bylaws, a completed CDA board list, signed conflict of interest forms from anyone involved in the decision-making, administration, and procurement of the CDBG program, secondary employment forms signed by all CDBG-funded personnel, proof of E-Verify registration, CBI clearance demonstrating that you have a current business license or exemption and are current on your taxes, and an active registration with SAM.gov. We would also need general liability and vehicle liability insurance, and if applicable, workers' comp, dishonesty or crime bonding, grievance policies for both your employees and the CDBG participants, conflict of interest and non-discrimination policies and affirmative action plan, personnel policies and procedures manual, and CDA's living wage affidavit form. Agencies seeking funding for construction activities have additional requirements. What is construction as it relates to CDBG? Construction in this context is non-housing, publicly owned facilities, such as recreation centers, or infrastructure, such as streets, playgrounds, and underground utilities or buildings, owned by nonprofits that are open to the general public. As you're working on your application for your project, a critical issue you will deal with is site control. The applicant may own the property, be leasing the property, or purchase the property through Land Reutilization Authority, or LRA. Through whatever means that you have control over the property, CDA requires that you submit proof at the time of application. As such, you would need a copy of the deed or the lease indicating any lease allowances. If you're getting an LRA property, you would need a copy of the special warranty, which does not guarantee against defects in the title in the same way as a general warranty. If you do not have a general warranty deed, CDA does not directly require proof of a clear title per se. However, the construction lender will require a title search to ensure a clear title prior to construction. If the site is city-owned, please provide a description of the interactions that you have had with LRA, EPS, or whoever the holding entity is. This is important for LRA properties, for example, because their deeds have clawback clauses, allowing LRA to seize the land if there's no viable redevelopment within a certain amount of time. So it is especially important under these circumstances that you are in communications with them as to your redevelopment plans and timeline. In general, it is important that you have buy-in from whoever is the municipal holding entity as early as possible. That allows for them to provide perspective and insight about the redevelopment that you may be unaware of, minimizing delays or misunderstandings down the road. The control has to be documented in the name of the entity that is applying. So if the property is held by you as an individual and your organization is applying for funding, that type of control is not sufficient. Make sure that the names on the application and on the document are aligned. Another item that you will need in your application is a project schedule. It is a timetable that outlines the start and end dates and milestones that must be met for the project to be completed on time. To the extent feasible, your project schedule should be mindful of delays, including delays due to supply chain issues. Also keep in mind that CDBG-funded projects require at least 6 months, if not longer, of preliminary work prior to site acquisition or putting a shovel into the ground. So please make sure that your organization considers this reality. The following statement is critical. Agencies cannot make any concrete moves towards site acquisition or construction until the environmental review, procurement processes, and any other requirements are completed. Therefore, for any project that would need to start before June of the following year, this is not your funding source, and your project will be automatically disqualified for construction funding. Other application requirements for your construction project include the following. We prefer design drawings to better understand exactly what it is we are funding and how it relates to the neighborhood that it is in. What is common for federally funded projects is that the Section 106 of the Historic Preservation Act is triggered, even if the site is not a historic building, nor is a designated city or a national historic district. Be mindful that you will have to maintain historic features of the building's exterior and the public areas within its interior to the extent that those qualities are existing. The Planning and Urban Agency, or PDA, is the city entity responsible for Section 106 reviews. We will also need photos of the existing area or the area of construction. These will be required for the Section 106 and the environmental review if the project is funded. There is a specific set of photos that are required, and it is convenient to have them in the application early on. Outdoor photos must include all 4 sides of the building and adjacent sites. Photos within the interior of the building should be of public spaces of the building and/or any woodwork or significant architectural features. We also have on the CDA website, a diagram detailing how these pictures should be taken. Furthermore, we need a professionally prepared construction budget. This is not a bid. Please do not take your project out to bid because CDBG regulations have very particular procurement requirements that must be adhered to. However, you can hire a professional construction estimator or pay a person who works for the general contractor to prepare a solid estimate. As mentioned before, if you're looking to construct on a city-owned property, early buy-in from the holding entity is critical. If you come up with numbers that do not coincide with what, for example, BPS thinks is reasonable, then they may not be willing to partner with you on the project. Also, they may have free resources, such as in-house staff that can determine construction costs for you. Keep in mind, which I assume that you already have, that costs may increase due to inflation or any other reasons. CDA cannot guarantee that the award amount can be increased, which is why we strongly encourage applicants to have leveraged funding to offset unanticipated costs. Lastly, CDA needs to see your experience as an agency, as well as key project personnel with a construction project. So at least the project name and include the project name and the scope of work. The scope of work should indicate if it is an interior and or exterior renovation, or was it built from the ground up. Indicate the start and end dates of the project and the site address. Indicate who was the architect and general contractor of the project. And provide the construction costs and the approximate square footage that was rehabbed or constructed. This information helps CDA gauge how capable the agency is able to execute the project that is being proposed. We would like to see experience of the agency and personnel doing something similar in scope and application. For instance, if you are only renovating the office area of your headquarters, it is not the expectation that your organization must have built a $100 million facility from the ground up. I've mentioned that the environmental review is required and that you can't even think to start putting a shovel into the ground or acquire a piece of property until it is completed. This is because any construction or site acquisition occurring without a completed environmental review is ineligible for CDBG funding. CDA conducts an environmental review consisting of a review of the literature and public databases involving all aspects of the environment. For example, we determine if there are endangered species known to frequent the area. We also determine what known contaminants are on site. We also look at not just the natural impact of the project, but also the social impact. Literature review in this realm may not be as robust. We expect that your proposals will supplement to our review by addressing environmental justice, which is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all persons, especially minority and low-income populations, with respect to both the positive and negative environmental and health impacts of a project. Your proposal, for instance, should answer questions such as these. Has there been any historical environmental injustices or disproportionate impacts burdened by low income and or minority populations within the neighborhood of the site? Do you have buy-in from the community? If it is determined that there are adverse effects on low income or minority populations, how will you inform the community about measures to remove, mitigate, or minimize the adverse effects? CDA does not do testing on the site. So if you need to do this as part of your due diligence for the project site testing, please share the environmental reports with CDA to expedite the environmental review process. In these ways, we make sure not to fund a project on an area that shelters endangered species or has contaminants or other environmental issues on the site. We also have to ensure that the project will have a positive impact on the natural as well as the social environment around it. Procuring contractors or general contractors must occur after the environmental review. Not receiving preliminary CDA approval will result in either the reissuance of the RFP or the rescinding of CDBG funding. Thus, it is critical that should you be funded, to keep close communications with CDA during this procurement process, as well as during the entire construction process. In the RFP, CDA will check for certain CDBG contract provisions and, when applicable, Section 3, Davis-Bacon, and MBE-WBE clauses. I will discuss these regulations in upcoming slides. The RFP must be formally advertised for 30 days in a general circulation paper, such as the St. Louis Post-Dispatch or the St. Louis Business Journal, a minority paper, such as the St. Louis American, and with the Crossroads Plan Room, a platform allowing for MBE-WBEs to review and bid on construction projects. Sealed bids must be used to ensure fair and open competition to prevent the soliciting agency from sharing competitive bidding information during the evaluation process. Be mindful that whoever prepares the construction budget cannot be selected as the contractor. The agency must select the lowest responsive bidder, which equates to the least expensive bidder that sufficiently addresses the scope of work. This slide covers key features of our procurement policy for construction projects. However, it is not all-inclusive. I again emphasize that it is critical that your agency keeps your CDA program monitor in the loop throughout the entire process so that he or she can best guide you to avoid any funding issues. MBE-WBE, or MWBE, refers to minority business enterprises and women-owned business enterprises. Monitoring of MWBE hiring practices is the responsibility of St. Louis Development Corporation, or SLDC. SLDC is a quasi-government branch of the City of St. Louis. If funded, SLDC will discuss more in depth with agencies how to comply with MWBE regulations. Under City Ordinance 70767, it is the goal that construction projects utilize a certain ratio of certain types of business enterprises. Under City Ordinance 71094, there are construction workforce goals, and that a certain percent of labor hours should be completed by certain types of workers. Any public improvement or facility activity awarded $2,000 or more in federal funding must comply with Davis-Bacon. The purpose of Davis-Bacon is to ensure that all construction workers are paid a prevailing wage. CDA verifies wages by reviewing certified payrolls or CPRs. CPRs are forms utilized by all laborers receiving federal funds that record hours worked, as well as the wages and benefits paid to each employee and the jobs those employees perform. Cross-referencing the CPRs, CDA will also interview workers to confirm their wages. CPRs are crucial in tracking the labor hours for both Davis-Bacon and Section 3 compliance and must be submitted to CDA on a weekly basis. Contractors will not get paid until the CPRs are received and CDA approved. Note that prior to the RFP, a memorandum of agreement or MOA may be needed to determine who will take the lead on monitoring Davis-Bacon requirements. If an agency is utilizing multiple federal funds, an MOA would indicate that whatever funder has the most skin in the game would be responsible for monitoring Davis-Bacon, while the other funders would cross-check their work. If the agency's site is owned by BPS, then CDA would enter into an MOA so that BPS would be the lead monitor for Davis-Bacon compliance. CDA also has monitors that specialize in Davis-Bacon and who will be able to assist you should you get funded. I will now pass the baton on to Stephanie Christian, who will briefly discuss Section 3 requirements.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Tayo. I was just going to ask to advance the slide. This will just be a very brief general overview of Section 3. Section 3 was implemented for certain projects that are funded by HUD to ensure that low to moderate income persons are provided economic opportunity on projects where public federal funds are applied. HUD reformed the Section 3 program in effect as of November 1st, 2020. Therefore, all qualifying projects awarded starting from the grant year 2021 and forward will follow the benchmarks under the new rule. These benchmarks are 25% of the total number of paid labor hours are to be performed by Section 3 workers, and 5% of the total number of paid labor hours are to be performed by targeted Section 3 workers. Next slide, please. A project qualifies as a Section 3 project if the total amount of CDA funding for construction is equal to or greater than $200,000. Section 3 requirements apply to the entire project, not only the portion of the project that CDA funds will be paying for. For example, if a public facility that provides an after-school program for youth would like to renovate 3 classrooms, CDA funds will cover the expenses for 1 classroom, while other non-federal funds will cover the other 2. The total labor hours and Section 3 labor hours are calculated from those of all 3 classrooms. CDA must issue a letter of approval for Section 3 plan in order to execute the work program contract. Reimbursements will not be issued from the comptroller's office without the executed contract. Quarterly reports and year-end summary reports must be submitted on time, starting from the date of the Section 3 approval letter through the close of the construction project. Next slide, please. After the funding awards are announced, the CDA Section 3 coordinators are notified of all new Section 3 projects. The Section 3 coordinator will reach out to the contact person for your project to provide an introduction, details of requirements and instructions, and all the necessary CDA forms. Once CDA receives the completed forms back from you, we will review and identify any corrections or revisions that may be needed, including additional supporting documentation, and request those from you. Once we receive the Section 3 plan back in its entirety, CDA will issue a letter of approval. Next slide, please. The Section 3 program intends that contractors and subcontractors who qualify as a Section 3 business concern receive priority when you are awarding bids. Start working with your CDA Section 3 coordinator early and communicate regularly to help the process move as smoothly as possible. Be as prompt as you can to respond to any CDA requests. Timeliness of this process is greatly dependent on your responsiveness. Thank you. Please let us know any questions.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. One thing I want to highlight, you had spoken about Section 3 applying to everyone, all the labor hours applying to everyone, whether or not we are paying for those labor hours. I want to piggyback off of that in terms of when Davis-Bacon or Section 3 is triggered. So Those two regulations are triggered based upon the total federal funding used in the project. So if you're awarded $100,000 in CDBG, then receive another $300,000 in other federal funds, that would be a total of $400,000 in federal funding. So even though we only contributed $100,000, your project is still subject to Section 3 because the total federal allocation exceeds the $200,000 threshold. So if you are interested in submitting a proposal for construction, I would recommend starring these last two slides. Earlier, I reviewed items needed from everyone. Construction applications will need to provide additional items, which are your project resume, your proof of site control, the project schedule or timetable, a professional construction budget from a construction cost estimator. Remember that whoever creates the budget cannot be selected as the contractor or GC. Interior and exterior photos of the building and its surrounding area. There is an online picture taking diagram, as I mentioned, that explains the process more in depth. If applicable, please provide descriptions of your interactions with the city holding entity. Ideally, you should have their buy-in at this point. If applicable, your experience with sealed bids, Section 3 and/or Davis-Bacon. And if you have them, descriptions of any Section 106 and/or environmental assessments you have conducted. Here are additional items needed for construction projects, should you be awarded, but prior to be entering into a contract with CDA. At this point, you must have solidified buy-in from city holding entities if the site is city-owned. You would need design documents if you did not provide them during the application process. During the application stage, we requested descriptions of any Section 106 and/or environmental reviews conducted. At this point, we would need those actual documents. So these documents, in conjunction with the design documents and photos, would be utilized by PDA to complete the Section 106 review and by CDA to complete the environmental review. Also, no construction, demolition, acquisition, and so on has taken place. This is important, otherwise you will not receive funding. And lastly, you have not procured your contract, being mindful that whoever who provided your budget cannot be selected as your contractor. So this concludes our presentation. Are there any questions or comments? So the question is, where can I find requirements for city agencies? You're talking about, for most city agencies, so if they're, meaning that when I talk about city agencies, I am referring to agencies within the city of St. Louis. Could this person specify, is this an agency within the city of St. Louis, or is it another governmental agency, so I can best answer their question? I'll give that person a minute to type that information. Okay, city agency, so City of St. Louis. So the requirements are similar. Obviously, some of those, the IRS determination letter would not be applicable. And so that would just be an instance where it'd be NA. I'm just trying to think of the RFP in my mind, if there's anything in addition, which I can't think of anything addition. It might be a matter of some things not being applicable, but there would not be anything additional that you would need to provide. I hope that answers your question. So so also related to city entities, what about city personnel policies? So for that, I believe we all have the same city personnel policies. You might have a policy that is also specific to your department. I know CDA also has policies particular to us, so that's what you would need to submit to us. Okay, another question. Can fiscally sponsored projects apply? I'm not quite sure. Could you please clarify so I can properly address that question? And another question, to confirm, our agency should add the City of St. Louis as an additional insurer. Yes, that is correct. And I'm going to wait for clarification regarding one question. Organization to use. So you're trying to clarify, you're saying organizations who use another nonprofit status is fiscally sponsored. Justin, are you, okay.
I'll go ahead and chime in on that.
Okay, thank you.
Typically, a nonprofit will need to have its own individual status. If you are sharing a status or any type of arrangement with another nonprofit, you would need to indicate that in your application and possibly provide some additional detail to CDA in regards to your application. There's a few instances where there may be a joint application. However, you typically would be expected to have your own nonprofit status separate from other entities.
Thank you, Justin. I hope that answers your question. Okay, I'll wait for another moment to see if there are any additional questions. Okay, right before I conclude, I just want to make sure that everyone can see the chat that includes our website information. If not, if you can let me know so I can include that information. I guess I should say, if you can see it, if someone can just let me know, please, that would be greatly appreciated. Well, what I'll do then, I'll just copy it again in hopes that everyone can see that information. Well, I thank you so much for your time. We encourage you to register for all of our other capacity building trainings. Thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.